Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Marina Fogle. To put why I'm here into context, I founded the BUMP class. It's an antenatal class which aims to give parents the very best start, or expectant parents the very best start to being a parent. And I also present The Parenthood, which is a podcast dedicated to conversations around all aspects of parenting, from preconception to the teenage years. I've always been aware of the work that Tommies are doing, but after my third child, Willem, was stillborn in 2014, I decided that I needed to know more. I ended up meeting Professor Alex Heazell when I went up to St Mary's Hospital in Manchester in 2015. I remember being a little bit nervous. It was a grey day, a long journey, and I'd not visited a maternity ward since I'd left empty-handed after Willem died. I'd anticipated a day that would be hard, and I'd feared that the sadness that had been such a big part of my life would darken my mood even more. Turned out I was in for a surprise. I returned to London uplifted and elated, not because we pretended that stillbirth didn't exist. Professor Heazell's work was all about addressing stillbirth. But having experienced a stillbirth that no one could explain, I finally found a team who weren't willing to take "we just don't know" for an answer. Here were a group of fiercely intelligent people whose work, tenacity, and dedication were focused on working out why unexplained stillbirths happen so that they could be prevented. I often speak to couples in the early days after they've lost a child to stillbirth, and many ask what made me feel better. And there's no magic cure for feeling happy again after your baby's died. But I will say that seeing firsthand the work that is being done by Tommies, the realization that even though this happened to me, that this is not okay, and that there are people working to change this for other couples, for future generations, for our children, it was one of the most reassuring and healing things that I'd experienced. And so it is with great pleasure that I'm hosting this evening. Professor Alex Heazell is the clinical director of the Tommies Maternal and Fetal Health Research Centre. He is obscenely bright, with specialist training in obs and gynae as well as a PhD. He splits his time equally between clinical care, so looking after expecting parents and delivering their babies, and also research, with his main focus being on how the placenta goes wrong in stillbirth and how we can predict this. Like this is not enough to have on his plate, Alex also has 3 children, and I learned yesterday some chickens. Alex, slightly off topic, how are the chickens? Are they behaving?
They're settling in very well, actually, thank you. I've managed to, we've had another 3 egg days, so we're feeling positive.
Gosh, it's all about birth, isn't it? Every aspect of life. Well, I promise we're going to move on from the chickens. But before we start talking to the group here of all of you who've joined us, we'd love for you to ask questions. I've got a few prepared, but we'll have time at the end for questions. The best way to do this is using the Q&A function. I know that after the last year, we should all be Zoom experts, but if you're anything like me, you often get confused by it. So just to clarify, at the bottom of your screen, in the center, you'll see 3 icons: a chat function, a raise hand, and a Q&A function. So if you'd like to submit a question, please type it into the Q&A function, not the chat. And if we don't have time to answer your question this evening, we'll get back to you after the event. So on with the show. Alex, we are going to talk about your research. What I'm really dying to know, and what always certainly interests me sort of personally, is just talking about stillbirth. What do you see as the most important research questions around stillbirth? What are the burning questions that you have for the next 5 to 10 years, and what do we still not understand? I mean, I know there's a lot, but I'm sure you can give me a window into it.
I think there's 2 sides, I think, that we really want to try and develop. The first, I think, is to still try and reduce the number of unexplained stillbirths, and I think to understand better how the placenta fits into that, because still a lot of the time when parents are told that we don't know why a baby dies, sometimes they come and see us for a second opinion in Rainbow Clinic, and after they've had a stillbirth, and actually you look at it and you think, actually that placenta wasn't quite right. It was a very small placenta for a very big baby, or there were other signs that things weren't, a baby wasn't growing normally. And so I think trying to really minimize the number of stillbirths that we think are truly unexplained. And I think the other side of that is really getting a better handle on what else is happening to the mum. So I think a really under researched area is things like, can a mum's cardiovascular system, so her heart and her blood vessels, do they change enough? Is there a point at which they can't meet the developing baby's needs, and then that leads to a stillbirth? So I think there's some really interesting questions about both the placenta, the mum, and also how the placenta and the baby, the baby and the mum interact through the placenta. So I think they're some of the really big questions for us moving forward. Because I think if we understand those things better, I think we will ultimately have fewer unexplained stillbirths.
And I know, the placenta is often sort of described as the key to a sort of successful pregnancy. And I know that women who have experienced a stillbirth before are very, very closely monitored in your Rainbow clinics, which I really do want to talk about. But are you getting any closer to predicting in women with no previous obstetric history whether or not those placentas might fail?
I think we're getting a lot better at trying. I think a lot of work has been done in convincing the people who provide maternity care that actually to label mums as high or low risk is actually really unhelpful, because there are some mums who are high risk, but actually the thing that makes them high risk is relatively moderate, and there are other mums and actually who are labeled as low risk, and often because they miss they narrowly miss a whole bunch of thresholds, and to kind of argue that isn't really how biology works. So what we really need to be doing is to having individualized care that really listens to what mums needs, but also reflects that. So we're able now through the research clinics in Manchester to better group mums by looking at how normal the blood flow is at 23 weeks of pregnancy in mums who we know are at increased risk of having a small baby or having a placental problem later on. So, and by doing that, we can then we can thankfully reassure some of them and say, actually, your placenta looks like it's formed just fine. And so you should have standard care. There are other women who we might say, well, actually, we thought, because you're young and fit and healthy and everything else, everything should be fine. Well, actually, we've done the scan and we want to keep a closer eye on you. So that I think I think that's been a really big change in how we deliver care. And I think also through the working with the Tommy's Fifth Centre, where they're trying to get an app to really enable women to get a better feel for their maternity care. I think, again, getting that sort of individualized care for women will be a big step forward, I think.
And I know a lot of the work that Tommy does is also to do with informing women, because obviously if you're pregnant, you're with your pregnancy the whole time. And I know that sort of educating women in terms of understanding changes in their pregnancy, changes in fetal movement is a crucial part. How big a part of being more aware of when pregnancy is not going to plan is that maternal awareness?
I think it's very important. I think one of the challenges that we've had for a number of years is trying to use signs like whether a baby's moving normally or not, and those sort of things for to tell us about how well a baby is. And actually, I think what a lot of these things boil down to is it's listening to the mum. And if a mum tells you that she doesn't feel well, if she has abdominal pain or bleeding, or her baby's not moving, they're all things that we need to listen to and not dismiss. Now, thankfully, certainly in the case of, say, babies' movements, we know that actually when a mum comes with reduced movements, actually 70% of those babies will be normally grown and they won't have a problem at all. Then what we need to do is to say, well, what else can we do to find perhaps the 1, 2, or 3 babies that were running into trouble that we needed to do something about, and reassure the other mums that everything was fine. So I think actually educating mums about symptoms and things like going to sleep on your side, having perhaps reducing your caffeine if you tend to have a very high caffeine intake before pregnancy, those sort of things. Actually, I think we can empower women both to look at their things like their diet and those sort of things, but actually also to make sure that health professionals take their concerns seriously, because it's kind of heartbreaking when you hear stories where people have gone with very legitimate concerns and not been listened to.
Well, I know that one place that absolutely does not happen are the rainbow clinics, which I came to visit when I was up in Manchester, and it was amazing to see. For those who are listening who don't understand what a rainbow clinic is, will you just explain what you do in the rainbow clinic?
Yes, so Rainbow Clinic is, I should say, a pregnancy after loss clinic. So we specifically set up a service to care for parents in a pregnancy after their baby died. Not everyone goes on to have another pregnancy, but around about 80% of women and their families do. And sadly, we know that those mums who do get pregnant again have a 5-fold increased risk of another stillbirth compared to a mum that's never had a stillbirth, and also increased risk of problem with preeclampsia and growth restriction and other pregnancy problems. So what we wanted to do was have this specialist clinic that aimed to improve outcomes and also by making sure mums get the best medical care, but also to improve psychological support so that we're with them alongside that we're alongside them during their pregnancy, which is a roller coaster for parents inevitably. And the rainbow clinics, we very carefully evaluated them when they first came out, and we showed that actually we were able to reduce the number of babies born early from 20% down to 10%. We reduced the number of times mums were coming to hospital for emergency appointments, and we improved mums and their partners' experiences of care in the pregnancy. And we've now seen nearly 1,000 families, and we've in that 1,000 we have sadly, there was one baby that was stillborn, and there were 2 babies that passed away after birth, but that's much less than actually the general population. So we think what we do in Rainbow Clinic is an effective way to improve the outcome for mums in these pregnancies. And we've Tommy's have supported us to roll that out. So we've now actually got over 20 Rainbow Clinics around the UK, and we're now seeing if we get the same improvements in outcome in all these other hospitals. And I think if we can do that, then we can encourage more and more units to have their own specialist clinic.
It's fascinating. It's amazing just to hear, because I think for a lot of parents who have lost a baby, the idea of being pregnant again and coping with the stress and not knowing is something that is incredibly intimidating. And to know that there is specialist care available, is incredibly reassuring. I know makes all the difference for people who take the kind of decision to try and have another baby after loss. Sorry, go ahead.
No. I was just going to say, and I think it's. I think of all the things that we have done, there are some really simple things that have been able to improve care, but I think it's the thing that's resonated the most with health professionals, and we've even had interest in having rainbow clinics as far apart as Australia and the United States. So it's something that hopefully, it really might. If we could light a blue touch paper and it could really spread, which would just be fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know one thing that, if you've ever been pregnant, women are familiar with the urine samples that you have to do with pretty much every checkup, and that's and blood pressure monitoring, and that's obviously to monitor for preeclampsia, which I think it's linked to placental dysfunction, isn't it?
Absolutely. So one of the reasons that mums get preeclampsia is that the placenta stops working normally, and in preeclampsia, we think the placenta makes things that go into the mum's blood that then make her wider blood vessels misbehave, basically.
And so what are you doing research into this to see how we can, whether we can improve the outcome for people whose pregnancies are affected by preeclampsia?
Manchester is one of the big placental research centres in the UK, is really interested in preeclampsia. And again, this sadly still ties into stillbirth, because mums who have preeclampsia have an increased risk of stillbirth, in part because their placenta isn't working, but also they're more prone to problems like placental abruption, which is when the placenta comes away before baby is born. And we've got projects looking at whether it's actually the lining of the womb and those very, very early events in pregnancy that mean a mum is more likely to get preeclampsia, and we've also got signs to look for whether we can better detect it later on in pregnancy, and also whether the blood pressure tablets that we give to control it actually can improve outcome. So there's so many things that we could improve about preeclampsia, and really making sure blood pressure control is really good is probably one of the easiest things that we can do. And so trying to work out what is actually the best tablet is a study that's currently going on with us.
And is it well diagnosed? I mean, I remember just endlessly having loads of tests, but also being aware that, persistent headaches, kind of swelling was something that I needed to flag up with the hospital.
Absolutely. And again, a bit like some of the other symptoms, some of those symptoms aren't terribly reliable. So actually one of the big changes that's happened through research is that we now have the placental growth factor test that was worked on a great deal by the Tommy Centres in Kings and also in Manchester, and that has shown that it makes a better diagnosis for preeclampsia. So actually, instead of doing loads and loads of blood pressures and loads of urine tests, and sometimes getting results that didn't quite make sense, actually now we can do a blood test, and the blood test gives us a reliable result for actually over a week. So if that blood test is normal, we know that the chances of the mum developing preeclampsia in the next week is very, very small indeed. Equally, if the mum does have a high blood test, sometimes it means that we need to deliver baby, but other times it means that we just need to be keeping a very, very watchful eye on. So it's absolutely changed our practice, having a blood test to replace some of these measurements that were less reliable.
Yeah, because obviously preeclampsia is one of the big reasons for premature birth, where babies are forced to be delivered early. But
absolutely. And quite often at those sort of very severe and early times, actually a week makes a huge amount of difference. If we're turning a baby that would have been born at 27 weeks into a baby born at 28 weeks, then actually, that's a significant improvement in baby's survival and also its long-term outcomes. So, those sort of seemingly quite small gains can be very significant for babies and mums and dads.
And so, I mean, obviously, your focus is on stillbirth. I've heard that there may be a link between the sort of role of diet and nutritional supplements in terms of preventing stillbirth. This is something that's new to me. Can you talk to me about this study and finding out?
So we're really excited because potentially using things like nutritional supplement and diet, and we're particularly interested in beetroot and beetroot juice because it's very high in nitrate, and that is a substance that helps our blood vessels dilate. And we started off actually because cyclists, high performance cyclists, tend to use these nutritional supplements to improve performance because it helps the blood vessels dilate. They get more blood to and oxygen to their muscles, and they can, they're better cyclists as a result. So we've been looking at that in pregnant mums, and we've shown that in mums with high blood pressure, beetroot juice can actually reduce blood pressure. As well, other types of fruit and vegetables contain these things called extracellular vesicles, which are like little pockets, if you like, of nutrients. And we showed that actually the placenta, these travel around mum's bloodstream, and the placenta takes them up. And they may contain things that make the placenta work even better. So they're not the same as vitamins, but they essentially provide more nourishment and goodness. And we're trying to see whether those can make the placenta work better, because if we can, then potentially we can give those to mums at the highest risk of complications, or even when we've done a test. So say we've shown that the blood flow to the womb isn't normal, can we then give some of these dietary or nutritional supplements to change how those blood vessels are behaving?
And being dietary nutritional substances, does that mean that the risks presented by them is lower?
We think so. They would still have to be really rigorously checked and researched before we can give them to pregnant women, because essentially you're giving them in the same way that you're giving a drug. But because they're naturally occurring compounds, so for example, some of the extracellular vesicles that we're trying have come from either beetroot or watermelon or broccoli, so things that we would eat just routinely, then actually, yeah, they should in theory at least be safe and safer than a drug that we've made completely artificially.
And what's the time frame in terms of, if the trial goes well, what sort of time frame are you looking at in terms of before women can actually be taking this?
So some of it depends on the agent that you're trying. So one of the other things that we're really excited by at the moment is something called melatonin, which you might know is a hormone that helps us go to sleep. But actually melatonin is a really potent antioxidant. So it stops some of the damage in occurring in cells, particularly damage occurring due to having too much oxidative stress. So, and we know that happens in mums who are over the age of 40. And so what we want to do is we've done some experiments that show that actually melatonin can rescue what the placenta looks like if we grow it in the lab. And also we have to go through a stage of doing some animal experiments to show that it doesn't do anything bad to the babies. And then actually that sort of drug, we could be going to mums within 2 to 3 years, because it's something we've got good safety data on already. Some of the other newer things like the extracellular vesicles, we've still got to go through some of those stages. And so that's probably looking more like 5 years until we're able to test it in a human. And some of that seems frustrating, but at the end of the day, we're asking pregnant mums to take a drug and to take something that we think is going to make a difference. Now, I wouldn't take something if I didn't really believe it was going to be safe and might help me. And so I think we've got to be able to give that reassurance to our mums.
And I know that kind of approving medicines and drugs is a notoriously long-winded process. Obviously, in this
yeah.
has the development of the COVID vaccine in sort of record time, do you think that's done anything up to sort of speed up the medical innovation?
I think actually the biggest thing that's given us is the argument that pregnant women should be included in clinical trials. One of the most helpful things, and Lucy Chappell, who is the professor at King's in the Tommy Centre there, was involved in the recovery trial, and she argued very strongly that pregnant women should not be excluded from the trial, because in so many other areas we say, oh, we can't do those tests in pregnant women because it's too risky. And actually the net result of that is we have a huge information gap. And you see it, we've seen it very clearly with the challenges of vaccinating pregnant women for COVID. And we should have been vaccinating pregnant. We should have had trials for mums, just like we had trials for everybody else. Because the reason that JCVI couldn't approve it for pregnant mums at the same time as they did for everybody else is that there wasn't the data. It wasn't they didn't care about pregnant mums. They can only make a decision on data in front of them. So I think what COVID has done is it's taught us that we have to do trials on pregnant women. And that has been helpful. And hopefully we can take that lesson forward, that we stop it, that we really encourage people and drug companies and research councils that actually we should be doing trials on pregnant women.
Is that the same across the world? Or any countries including pregnant women in their trials?
America actually did. America included, when they were testing their vaccines, they included, so actually the bulk of the data that initially led the JCVI to change their mind here was generated in America. So we do need to learn lessons about how we translate this, because those of us who want to be able to give the best care to mums and babies, we need that information. We can't make that information. We have to have that in front of us.
Yeah. And how, in your mind, has COVID affected the experience of pregnancy? I mean, it's obviously you're dealing very often with people that are having a very anxious time anyway. You add to that the anxiety of living through a pandemic. What have you seen it's been like?
I think it's been really variable. I think we've been very lucky in that we made, I can remember we had a staff meeting very early on in the pandemic, and we were able to protect the research clinics, and except for a very short period in lockdown 1, partners were always able to come with mums. We didn't cancel any scans. We kept the care going exactly as it was. And that was, I think that was actually important for us as a staff, because we wanted to carry on giving the best care to mums and their families that we could. But I am aware that it's had quite significant impact on all sorts of different experiences of pregnancy. And I hope that, when the dust has settled, that we use this to learn the lessons about the things that that we really must do, and that even the importance of having a partner with you. That there's been some terrible stories of mums being given really bad news, and their partner's been out in the car park, all sorts of things like that. So I think for some individuals, I think it's been really difficult experiences. In terms of, like I say, as we've tried to do the research, we've carried on. It's been within the research centre. It's been very disruptive, because we've gone from all being in the same building at the same time to people working from home and going in together. But having the Tommy's funding gave us the opportunity to actually start trying to answer some questions about COVID. So. And we were able to partner with colleagues in Canada and France. So we've just managed to publish a paper of over 100 cases of COVID in pregnancy, and looking at the changes that you see in the placenta when the baby is healthy. And now we're about to start doing some work about trying to understand why COVID seems to cause a very severe reaction in a small number of placentas, but not in others. So actually there has been that opportunity as well, and we're very grateful to Tommy's for that, because had we not had the centre funding, we just couldn't have done that, because we did try to get money from the Medical Research Council, but unfortunately they said that they thought the chances of COVID having an adverse effect on the placenta were very unlikely, so they didn't want to spend their money on it. Which is really frustrating when we're now stuck in a situation when we think it probably does. But that's research.
Yeah, well, thank goodness for your work. And you obviously split your time between kind of clinical work and research. How do you do that? Is there one that you prefer more? Do you get sort of addicted to a sort of idea or a project that you're working on? How does that work for you on a day-to-day basis?
That's a really good question. I think it ebbs and flows. I love having the mixture. That and my clinical work is where so many of the research questions come from, because they come from talking to parents, and they come from just doing the scans in Rainbow Clinic and thinking and having ideas. And I think if I was just doing research, I would really, really miss the clinical contact. I love seeing and caring for patients. And it's really, really rewarding. I mean, to be able to see sometimes some really complex cases and mums go on, they have healthy babies. It's just the best feeling in the world that you've made a difference to somebody, and that's great. And the research is, as we've just talked about, going through those approvals. It can be a really long, drawn out process, but actually, seeing a baby born, makes you realise it's all worthwhile. So I really enjoy the balance.
Well, and I suppose it all comes together when what you've been doing research on becomes available in a clinical setting.
Absolutely, and actually being able to, being able to show that something changes care and something improves care, and that's great. I mean, some of the work that we've done, the Sleep on Side campaign that Tommy's were so supportive with about 5 years ago, that's now part of national NICE guidelines. And so, although these things can take a long time, hopefully that fundamentally changes care for everyone, and that's a good thing.
So I love hearing about all the different research projects that Tommy's is invested in. One of the things I've heard about briefly is the Velocity project. Can you explain it and let us know kind of what are the findings and what are the lessons that you're learning from that?
So the Velocity project is specifically looking at the growth of babies in mums who are diabetic. So we know that mums with diabetes tend to have bigger babies, but occasionally have very much smaller babies. And we also know that mums with diabetes have an increased risk of stillbirth. And to some extent, that relates to how well controlled their sugar is. So we put lots of effort into trying to make sure their sugar control is good. But actually, it doesn't tell us the whole story. So what Velocity is doing is trying to look at different tools to measure babies' growth. And so as ultrasound technology has improved, we can actually now measure, instead of measuring just the length of the bones in baby's leg, we can measure how thick baby's thigh is. So if you imagine, if you're a really chunky big baby, you've got a bigger thigh volume than if you're a skinny baby. And what Velocity is doing is trying to see whether that marker actually is a better predictor of how baby is doing in mums who have diabetes, and tells us when we should deliver babies, so we're not delivering babies early, but we equally aren't leaving babies that are at risk of complications on the inside.
It's quite difficult, isn't it, assessing a baby's size from scans? It's not an exact.
It definitely isn't, and so this is really why we want to get the best tools we can, and one of these things is about if we can get a tool that is quite easy to do, which actually doing thigh volume is pretty straightforward. It's also very reproducible. That this is again something that it's not done as routine in practice at the moment, but it's the sort of thing that could be if you can show that there's a benefit to doing it. So these are the sort of first steps along that line. If you can show that we can measure it accurately, we can measure it reproducibly, and it's beneficial, then we can begin to really make a difference for that group of mums.
I love hearing these simple things that you're coming up with that are just going to make such a profound difference. One of the things I know that you're working on was a fetal monitoring vest, which I understand has been delayed. Is it back on track now? And where will they be used and when will they be used?
So that project has again been a bit of a roller coaster because of COVID. So one of the things that COVID did with stock groups is to face-to-face studies. And we are just now going through some regulatory hoops about the device so that we can use it in pregnant mums. And then we'll be able to test whether it's essentially the sort of vest that sportsmen wear, like professional athletes. They have all this feedback so that there's, you see the guys on the touchline with their computers working out whether they should substitute them or not. Essentially, it's using that sort of technology, but to measure a baby. Sounds really straightforward. The only snag is the baby's heart rate is 100 times more difficult to detect than mum's. So it's trying to get all of those signals, but we think this is our first step for doing that. And our plan is that they'll be used for mums who are high risk. And we've begun to work with a company that is using traditional technology, but actually beginning to use that in mums' homes. So instead of having to say, if we say to a mum, look, we're worried about your baby, you need to come to hospital every day for us to do a baby heart rate trace. We can actually now do that in the mum's home. The device Bluetooths to the mum's mobile, the mobile sends it to me, and I can watch the baby's heart rate on the computer screen. And so we're not having to ask a mum who potentially can't afford to keep coming to hospital on a regular basis to come every day. She can do that, and if there's a problem, I can say, right, you need to come to hospital now. So our idea is that we'll use this in mums who are high risk, and that it means we can keep a closer eye on that baby.
So it's basically continuous monitoring in the home through the mobile, harnessing
Yeah.
that we all have and have all paid for in our homes to make it more accessible for you.
Yeah.
Brilliant. And is it quite an uninvasive thing? I mean, you sort of mentioned this monitoring vest. Is it like a sort of life jacket, or is it something that is much more?
No, it's thinner. It's made of I'm trying to think. It's like a running vest almost, but just it's a snug. It does fit snugly because it has to be in contact with the mum's tummy. But it's not too bulky. The idea is that it will be that a mum could continue her normal activities while wearing it.
Amazing, I love it. So one final question from me before we go to the floor. So the other project that I've heard a little bit about is the CHI project. So could you explain to us what this is and again, give us an update?
Yeah, absolutely. So CHI is a quite rare but devastating condition. So the placenta is like roots of a tree. And normally mum's blood comes in here and baby's blood comes down here around the tips and goes back up. And in CHI, all of this space where mum's blood could be gets clogged up with white blood cells. So from the mum's immune system. And essentially, it's basically like organ rejection of the placenta. So a mum's body recognizes that the placenta doesn't belong to her because it's half of her partner. And then it attacks it like it would do as if I'd transplanted a kidney into her. And sadly, often mums who have this condition have multiple losses. So some of the worst cases I've seen, mums have had 5 pregnancy losses.
And are these sort of in the first trimester? Or
no, this is later. So it's usually between the second and third. These are late losses. And sadly, it can be missed by pathologists, and or even if a pathologist tells a general doctor who doesn't recognise it what it is, they just say, "Oh well, it'll probably not happen again. It'll be fine." Actually, the chances of it happening again are between 70 and 100%. And if it happens again, you've got a 50% chance of the baby dying before it's born. And so some of these mums have awful histories. And we have found a combination of drugs that alter how the mum's immune system talks to itself that seem to dampen down this inflammation. We can essentially stop the placental inflammation and we're just about to publish a paper that shows that in 38 women we've had 38 live-born babies. And I think this has really big implications, because it would be the first time that we've shown that there's an effective treatment for CHI. And, you know, we can argue that doesn't necessarily affect huge numbers of women, but it makes an enormous impact for those women that have that complication. And it also helps us better understand it. So one of the challenges of CHI is we can't make a diagnosis in the womb. So we're using MRI scans to see whether the placenta looks different before birth. And that would mean that we could potentially treat mums ahead. So they wouldn't have to lose a baby, then get a diagnosis, then get the treatment they need. So we could potentially intervene before that.
Amazing. Amazing. I'm in awe. I love hearing all of this, and I'm sure I'm echoing the feelings of everyone in this virtual room. So I've got a few questions from our audience. So firstly, how do you make sure research findings from the centre make their way into NHS practice?
So the first way is by doing, there's a fairly straightforward path of studies that we need to do. And so we use a lot of the money that Tommy's gives us, enables the basic science work to be done and the initial clinical studies to be done, that we can then go and do. We then apply for even larger grants that give us a definitive answer. And we can then, when we have that answer, we can go to NICE, or we can go to the people that make the policy decisions and say, look, this makes things better, and they then validate that.
Thank you. How grateful are they? Do you come to them and they're like, oh my God, you're amazing, thank you so much for making our jobs so much easier? Or is there a bit of sort of, ooh, what, you're cleverer than we are?
I don't think it's like that. I think that they have, you know, they need convincing, and they need to make sure that what we're spending money on is the right things. And I think it's about trying to make that solid argument. And that's our job. That's our job as researchers and clinical researchers, is to say to people, look, here is the need for this. You know, and we could do something slightly paradoxically. Sometimes it's even harder to do it for something simple. And actually, the case for going to sleep on your side, which several studies have showed was linked to a risk of late stillbirth. And so the answer is you just need to go to sleep on your side, not laid flat on your back. That because it was something relatively simple, it took quite a long time to change people's minds. And I'm sure if we had like a special magic tablet, and if I said to them, here, take a magic tablet, and it reduces your risk of stillbirth, then it would have been easier. Sorry.
And in terms of, I mean, we've got a question to do with the really rare complications like CHI. How consistently are things like CHI diagnosed across the UK, and how is Tommy's trying to change this?
So not very, and we know that that's a big problem. So it's not only not necessarily treated consistently, but also not diagnosed consistently. So one of the parts of the CHI project that we're trying to do, and also the placental pathology, is that we're trying to automate it. So we're trying to say, if we do certain stains on the placenta and actually count numbers of cells, that is you know, a better way of doing it than just somebody looking down a microscope and giving you their opinion. And so, you know, so in the CHI project, we've found that basically if you have more than 50 of these immune cells in the placenta, that's associated with a bad outcome. If it's less than 50, it isn't too bad.
Yeah. And a more general question, what do you think is the most promising new research area for stillbirth?
Wow, that's a good question. I think in terms of the impact on most families, I think one of the most promising things is the Rainbow Clinic model of care. I think by having that specialist model, you can make sure the mums that need it, who are at increased risk, get the care that they need. So, to give you an idea, the 20 Rainbow clinics that are in the UK at the moment are seeing on average about between 50 and 70 women a year. The one in Manchester we're seeing about 145, but that's because we're seeing mums from kind of all over the place. So we're talking about changing care for thousands of women, and that's making, I think, so that for me is the thing that's going to make the biggest, most rapid difference. I think in the long run, I think the beetroot data and the melatonin data are also really exciting, that we might be able to have quite simple treatments that will alter risk of pregnancy complications.
Okay, one last question. Do research findings and studies make their way into training for health? How do they make their way into training for healthcare professionals, or is there a delay?
There is sometimes a delay. I think one of the great things about having the Tommy's centres are multidisciplinary, and so within Manchester we've got midwives, we've got obstetricians, we've got basic scientists. So when there's a scientific discovery, the scientists go and educate the BSc scientists when they give them their lectures. As clinicians, we're training. We're able to say, whenever we give a talk to our peers, we're there telling them, this is what we're doing next. This is what is on the horizon. You need to watch because this is where it's going. And that's really, really helpful. And Suzanne and Emma, who are the midwives who are funded by Tommy's, again, do the same within the midwifery field. And they're real champions for advancing care. So I think if you sit around and you wait for your if you were passive and you just said, I've discovered this, I'm going to put it out there and I'm going to wait to see how long it takes to get into a textbook, then you're going to be waiting years. If you make that an active process and see that as the dissemination of the work that we're doing, then I think it can be really rapid.
Yeah, and presumably using sort of digital media and social media as another way of kind of reaching.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's another reason actually having our, being funded by Tommy's is brilliant, but actually also Tommy's gives us, because it's got such good information services and information lines, that it works both ways. So, when we find something, Tommy's are really great about getting it out there. Certainly much better than me writing it in a scientific journal.
Yeah. Another question, what do you know about stillbirth and pregnancy care that you didn't know a year ago?
So, some of the really exciting things that we've looked at in the last year have been looking at the amount of caffeine. We did that analysis in the last year, the MINUS study, that showed that mums who drink more than 200 milligrams of caffeine a day, which is basically sort of a large filter coffee, has an increased risk of late stillbirth. And so we worked then with the Royal College of Midwives to kind of revamp their guidance. I think we also have a much better handle on which placental problems happen again in the next pregnancy. So we can now give mums who come to Rainbow Clinic, we can say, actually, if you see this problem in the placenta, you don't need to be so worried, because actually that isn't going to happen again, or it's very unlikely to happen again. But if you see CHI or you see VUE or some of the other things, then you need to be more worried. So that's sort of clinical, quite simple information that's very easy for us to get out there. So I think they're some of the big things that we didn't know a year ago.
Well, it sounds like you've been incredibly busy during quite a tumultuous year, and it's so great to check in to hear what you've been doing. I do find it so inspirational and uplifting to hear what you and your team are doing. And it's also, it's hard to hear that so much tragic baby loss is preventable. The fact that you're on a mission to find out why and how to improve care is really heartening for all of us who have been affected by loss. So thank you so much for your time today. It sounds like you're an extremely hands-on father. So if you're not sort of saving babies' lives, you're looking after chickens and herding children. So thank you so much for your time today. I also want to thank all of you who have listened, who have joined this webinar, and for your questions today. I'm sure you found it as interesting as I have. And I'm also sure that, like me, you're kind of newly galvanized to raise both awareness and funds for these fantastic projects. So thank you all for giving us your time to join us here today to support the Tommy's mission to make the world a safer place in which to give birth. Please do join us and join the Tommy's team for other webinars. I look forward to maybe meeting some of you in the future. But Alex, thank you very, very much for your time today.
Muted myself because it all got a bit noisy. Yeah, no, thank you very much, and thank you so much to everyone else for joining. It's been a real privilege to be here.